In this module, we will discuss four basic theories: Marxism, gender studies, post-structuralism, deconstruction, and post-colonialism. At the end of this module, you should be able to understand basic theoretical frameworks, identify these frameworks in texts, and apply these frameworks to your analysis and writing. Let us start with Marxism. Marxism is a branch of study based on Karl Marx's treatise on economics, especially the Manifesto of the Communist Party and Capital. Marx studied the rise of industrialism in England and how this new economic system affected class relations. Basically, with the rise of industrialism, class and class struggle was simplified into the bourgeois and proletariat. As Friedrich Engels clarifies, by bourgeoisie is meant the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production and employers of wage labor. By proletariat, the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labor power in order to live. The manifesto itself is the product of a convention of like-minded communists, a growing threat, quote unquote. I would recommend reading the manifesto when you get a chance. Marxism stresses the importance of economics and class in our analysis of cultural phenomena. As Julie Rifkin and Michael Ryan state, Marxists stress that culture functions to reproduce the class structure of society. In other words, cultural phenomena can be used by the state to reinforce the status quo. Thus, cultural practitioners influenced by Marxism, or better put, having an innate distrust of the status quo, create cultural products that expose, undermine, or otherwise challenge the existing class or political structure. Further, Marxism proposes that all societies are constructed. This construction exists in two parts: the base and the superstructure. This infograph, taken from thoughtco.com, illustrates the relationship between the base and the superstructure. The base, which supports the superstructure, consists of the means of production, tools, factories, materials, and land, as well as the access to these assets. The bourgeois owned or had access to the means of production. The proletariats, not so much. The superstructure is literally a construction reared on the base, meant to disguise or obscure the true power relationships driving a society. In the superstructure, we find all the intangible qualities associated with civilization: art, culture, media, religion, family, law, science, and so on. Central to these intangibles are the ideologies created to justify the status quo. In other words, embedded in each cultural product are belief systems meant to naturalize a person's place in the economic system. Take racism, for example. This ideology that there's a hierarchy of race with white at the top of the pyramid has influenced philosophers like Kant, spawned the pseudoscience of eugenics, and shaped the colorism of the caste system. You get the idea. If we examine the diagram further, we see that the words listed to the left of ideology are elements which shape the dominant ideologies, while the words to the right are shaped by ideology. Remember, though, that this is not a linear or unidirectional exchange. From a cultural perspective, these ideologies influence cultural products, literature, music, art, drama, and festivals, even as these cultural products help define, shape, or replace ideologies. Likewise, laws, politics, and education may be reactions to the necessities of the base and simultaneously reflect the reigning social ideologies. As the base shifts, the superstructure shifts, and vice versa. It is possible that cultural products can, and very often are, used to expose rather than conceal ideologies and the base. In response, the base spins new ideologies and distractions. When applying Marxist theory to cultural phenomena, consider the economic structure of the culture. What is the system? What is the superstructure? Is it capitalist, socialist, communist, social democratic, or monarchist? How did the system evolve? Was it a feudal society, industrial, agrarian? Has the economic system changed? How and when? Who is in power? Which group has access to the means of production? Who owns the means of production? How is this power structure maintained? Through despotism, through law, media? What are the underlying ideologies? This is potentially tricky as many ideologies or isms may intertwine and morph. There may be different versions of an ideology, for example, capitalism and venture capitalism. Some ideologies grow out of other ideologies such as colorism from racism. Does the cultural product dismantle, highlight, or reinforce the status quo? In the case of Carnival, did the festival highlight, dismantle, or reinforce colonial hegemony? Another useful analytical theory, or I should say family of theories, is gender studies. There are three main lenses in gender studies: feminism, queer studies, and, the reason the term expanded, the flip side of feminism, the study of masculinity. Whichever lens you use, the genesis of gender studies is feminism. So I will focus on this more than the others. Growing out of the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s, feminist theory investigates gender disparities and codifies the language for such investigation. In other words, while women have often spoken out against gender inequalities, the female liberation movement concentrated these discussions as women en masse agitated for equal rights and status. While this is generally perceived as a good and necessary lens, feminism represents a few concerns, particularly from a cultural perspective. Feminism for many grew out of a Western and typically white perspective. Some of the assumptions underpinning the female liberation movement were decidedly based on the leisure classes. For example, feminists argued that women were barred by societal pressure and in some cases by law from entering the workforce. It was frowned upon to want any form of economic independence. While this is a legitimate concern, given the history of inheritance laws and other barriers to women owning their own property or earning their own money, up until the suffragette movement of the early 1900s, it was illegal for women to own property even through inheritance. It did not reflect that most women of color and lower class women were already working and earning and serving as the heads of their households. The assumption had to be disrupted and displaced to allow for a more complex understanding of what it means to be a woman in society. Specifically, feminism moved on to dismantle the cult of femininity, which defined womanhood as soft, irrational, and incapable of self-support, a definition which stripped working-class women and women of color of their femininity. Today, this Western perspective has the potential to hamper the natural development of feminism in non-Western spaces. A modern example would be the assumption that a hijab or burqa is oppressive. Such an assumption does not allow for the religious and cultural specificity It ignores, for example, that many women in Islamic countries do not deal with the same stereotypes barring them from male, quote-unquote, occupations such as science or math. Further, such Western assumptions are problematic as they are based on an exaggerated reclamation of sexuality, a complex issue anywhere. Another concern is that feminism, especially in a Western system built on cognitive binaries, is oppositional to masculinity. Alice Walker's theory of womanism is one counter-narrative to the us-them binary most opponents of feminism perceive. Womanism, proposed in the 70s, stresses a communal approach to gender equality. Women, especially women of color, have always been and will always continue to be equal partners with their men. The more freedom women have, the more freedom they can help their men find. This perspective is based on the historical role women of color have played as breadwinners in their households. What remains at the core of feminist theory is the unveiling of patriarchy and patriarchal ideology constructs. In the Caribbean context, the cult of femininity underpins the politics of respectability. Queer studies grew out of feminism by the late 80s into the 90s. As feminist discourse pushed against the naturalness of gender inequality, those who found themselves marginalized by the conversation because they were not trapped exclusively in a male-female dialectic started investigating and theorizing the aspects of gender relations that feminism missed because of heteronormativity. The important thing to note about queer studies is the theory that gender is a construct. There is a difference between one's biological sex, one's sexual orientation, and how one defines oneself. In fact, queer studies posits that people exist on a spectrum of sexuality, also evolving out of feminism and fueled by the emerging queer studies is the general term gender studies. Many theorists now recognize that it was impossible to address equality without addressing how masculinity and heteronormativity are constructed. When applying gender studies theory to cultural phenomena, consider gender inequalities in a society. How do women fare economically, politically, socially, educationally? What ideologies underpin cultural productions? Are women supposed to be docile and delicate? Are members of society expected to perform heteronormatively? Is any deviation from traditional gender roles tolerated? Who controls women's bodies? How are gender roles established and maintained? Does the cultural product uphold, challenge the ideologies, assumptions, or prescribed roles?